I'm Eleonor Wachtel, and this is Writers and Company. Today, one of the most brilliant minds and provocative thinkers of the 20th century, George Steiner. A conversation about his love of books, morality, and the marvels of language. Steiner died last week at the age of 90. In 1987, when George Steiner spoke at the University of Toronto, Northrop Frye called the lecture an historic event in its own right. Steiner, known for his passionate lectures and grand theories, had a daunting reputation. His terrain wasn't simply literature, but the nature of humanity. He was an iconoclast, feisty and erudite. He could quote from literature in a dozen languages. Once, on British television, he apologized for his written Danish being slightly poorer than he would like. Edward Said once wrote that Steiner is that rare thing, a critic propelled by diverse enthusiasms, an autodidact for whom no subject is too arcane. Steiner, he said, is to be read for his quirks rather than in spite of them. When I first met George Steiner in Paris in 1992, it was for a series I was doing about Western Europe. That program elicited an enormous response from listeners, I think because of the breadth and authority of his vision and his wide-ranging grasp of history and political systems. He talked about exile and displacement. He himself was born in Paris to Austrian Jewish parents. When he was 11, in 1940, the family fled to the United States. He credits his father's wisdom for their survival. He was a great teacher of uncertainty, and I owe him everything, said Steiner, who was one of only 2 Jewish pupils in his French school to survive the Holocaust. What I liked about talking to George Steiner was that you could ask big questions, impossible questions, because Steiner himself entertained them. For instance, he once said that central to everything he was and believed and had written was his astonishment, as he put it, that you can use human speech both to bless, to live, to build, to forgive, and also to torture, to hate, to destroy, and to annihilate. George Steiner studied at the University of Chicago, at Harvard, and at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. He taught widely in the U.S. and the U.K., but primarily at Cambridge and Geneva. He published more than 24 books, including Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, In Bluebeard's Castle, Grammars of Creation, and Real Presences. He also wrote a short intellectual memoir called Errata, An Examined Life. Last week, George Steiner died at his home in Cambridge. He was 90 years old. I last spoke to him in 1995 when he was in Toronto. Here's that conversation. In the opening sentence of your first book, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, published more than 35 years ago, you defined true criticism, true reading, as a debt of love. How did you come to acquire that sense of love?
I was struck already as a very, very young person by the notion that ours is not so much an age of anxiety, the very famous sentence of W.H. Auden, but an age of bottomless envy, that in the academic, in literature, what really characterizes our atmosphere is jealousy and envy of greatness, and a kind of awful little vengeance on what is great and universal. By the way, now, 35, 40 years later, this is a subject of Martin Amis's new world best-selling novel, which is a study of literary jealousy and envy of success. And I always felt that if you couldn't do the real thing, if you couldn't create yourself, if you were not inspired enough or lucky enough or brilliant enough or gifted enough to produce first-rate work, the next best thing and an immense joy and privilege was to help that work break through, get recognized, get read, get loved. And I've always conceived of myself, who am strictly of the second rank, strictly and non-creative, on that scale, I've always thought of myself as being immensely privileged to be of some use to the great work. We've all seen these breathtaking nature films where on a rhinoceros there sits a tiny bird. The bird helps clean the rhinoceros, gives him warning, enemies, but more interestingly tells others rhino is coming. And the really good teacher, the really good critic, the really good reader chirps away and says rhino is coming. And the test of a major critic, of a major presence, is, has he got some rhinos? Has he taken some gambles on what will be the classic of tomorrow? I've tried always to be of use to the new, but also to bring the classic back, which is always new. So in that sense, it's an act of love, of delight, of feeling privileged and honored. And what has made it very difficult for me at times in what is called loosely the academy is that quite naturally the men and women around me do not like to think of themselves as very marginal, as ancillary figures, as auxiliaries to the real thing. But in that first book I said what, as I say, began the problems I've had in my long career, when I said if you could write one paragraph of Dostoevsky's novels, you wouldn't, for God's sakes, be around writing a critical book on him. Dostoevsky doesn't need to write about Steiner. Steiner has to write about Dostoevsky. And that the university does not like to hear.
Because also in your most recent critical book, Real Presences, at the beginning you postulate the disappearance, a society without what you call metatext, criticism or discussion of art, and you say that art would not really be diminished much by that.
That's, of course, a deliberate paradox and overstatement, but in a very real sense I mean it. We could do without 9/10 of our millions and millions of books about books, about other books, about books, if we could get people back to the primary shock, the great wing stroke and blaze of light of coming up yourself against a great major text or a new artistic experience. That's why I always quote a true story, which puts it so much better than any abstract words I can use. He had played a difficult etude, Schumann, and the younger people who were working with him and some of his friends who had heard it said, "Look, this is terribly difficult. Can you explain it?" And he said, oh yes, I can." And he sat down and played it again. This is to me a very, very important story. The way an artist explains is to enact, possibly to repeat. And one of the great adventures of recent years, as I speak to you, I've just arrived from Paris to register a birthday dialogue, 70th birthday, an hour with Pierre Boulez. And Pierre Boulez has made it a practice with a difficult piece, not necessarily only new pieces, but difficult 20th century music, played once at the start of the concert and then again at the end. I think that is a major pedagogic idea, to say, look, it is difficult, look, it is new, I'm going to explain it to you by letting you hear it again, which is another way of putting it. When you face a difficult poem or a great play or a great text, try it again, reread it. And there are, God knows, magnificent critical acts and commentaries and explanations. I was overstating my case just to get people to think about the overwhelming presence in our intellectual lives of the parasitic, of that which feeds on, feeds on, feeds on. And it's become almost ridiculous.
Obviously, you are, by taking an extreme position, putting yourself out in the margins, too, with your colleagues. So that's
And within my profession. But I've just finished 20 years in Geneva, where the main liberty was to read together, to read around a table. Students with very, very little secondary material. This is called the Geneva School. It's really quite simple, unpompous way of saying a return to primary texts with the help you need. It's not clear to me where this industry is going to end. It is finally devouring itself. we have more and more texts in controversy with other critical texts, and you're beginning to get a situation which has been put in a nutshell by what we call, and it's very difficult to take seriously in some ways, it's the most influential movement today, what we call deconstruction. And I don't want to go into that except for the formidable pun of its great leader, Monsieur Derrida, who says there are no texts, there are only pretexts. To me, that is a kind of inspired barbarism. In a sense, it has become hideously true, and we can almost date it. This is very fascinating. We've got a letter of W.H. Auden in the late 40s. He was earning his living teaching in the United States before returning to England. And he said, "Oh my God, I've begun to notice that my recent poems are written in the hope of being studied in a seminar. And, oh God help me, he suddenly saw, a very great poet, that what he was aiming at was to be respectable in the graduate seminar, to have papers written on those poems." And a panic, a kind of great panic, came over him, to become a pretext for Shakespeare doesn't need any of us. He's not a pretext. No poem is a pretext. And to regard literature as a kind of happy excuse for the analytic, the explanation, the monograph that will be written on it is, of course, to put the cart before the horse in a quite insane way. Deep down in every critic, there's a hatred of writers. Deep, deep down. You never know what those crazy people might do next. And that fear and hatred infects some of the principal, alas, teachers, critics in our time. More people are turned off literature, far more, by the techniques of analytic pedagogy than are brought home to it.
George Steiner, I want to go back, if you will, to what books you first read, how you first developed your own love, your own response to literature.
I was unbelievably fortunate. It was very much in the shadow of the rise of Hitlerism in Europe, but I was brought up in France and had two formidable strokes of luck. Above all, my father began training me very, very early on by reading only major books. I never really read much children's literature. And what he did, for instance, it was decisive. It marked my life. I can't have been more than 5, perhaps a little less. He would take a passage in the Iliad of fantastic excitement where somebody was throwing a spear at somebody or butchering somebody or lifting a sword, and he'd come and he said, "I'm awfully sorry. There's no translation of the lines that follow." And I, of course, believed him implicitly. And I was shaking with excitement. And he said, "Look, we've got to find out what's going to happen. Let's try it in Greek." And that was the beginning of my Greek, an absolute genius from on his part. I just couldn't bear not to find out. He would not let me have the next book until I'd written a tiny précis of the one I had just read or read with him. That was another terrific piece of training.
You were at Oxford when you were 5 years old,
in
essentially.
a sense, I was having home tutorials. Secondly, the French lycée system, in which I was brought up, with its terrific emphasis on literature, on articulacy, on poetry, on learning by heart, and with its splendid anti-democratic frankness, saying to us little boys in our blue overalls as we stood there, I shall never forget that, one of you in this big class, standing to attention, one of you may, by miracle, make a tiny scratch on the wall of culture with your nail. We're not saying you'll be Victor Hugo, we're not saying you'll be Zola, but you might write a book worth reading or find a theorem in math worth learning. one of you might just have the lottery ticket to do something of which humanity has some right to be proud, and it's the job of this hierarchic elitist system to find that one, and we're going to damn well try and do it. And I've never looked back on any theory of education from that moment on. It was a terrific incentive. It was something to strive for, to hope for. And you see, if you walk as a little boy in the morning to school and home in the afternoon, through streets marked Victor Hugo, Descartes, Pascal, Racine, you're going to begin doing some thinking. Something's going to rub off. They're not called maple or pine or broad or lake. The difference is simply enormous. And so again, no credit to me at all, no merit whatever. I had a very powerful training in memory, very powerful training in exact reading. As a matter of course, it never struck me as any kind of particular achievement, still doesn't. The system aimed for that and produced that life of the mind, that ambition of the mind, which is still in many ways the hallmark of a very tragically tired and divided Europe.
Very early on, you regarded literature as a central humanity, that it existed in a context that was embedded in philosophy, religion, political concerns. What was it in you that, in fact, rebelled against the conventions of specialization or the fashions of new criticism? I mean, why did you have to see things as interconnected?
Being polyglot, being actually brought up from birth in a whole number of languages.
We have German, French, English
to begin with, and Italian a little later. I could not be a specialist. Now, it's as simple as that. A polyglot mind sees the world in a kaleidoscopic, shifting, multiple light and manner. It looks out different windows on reality. It looks through different windows on its own perceptions and identity. Secondly, I had great good luck of falling flat on my face, but really on my face, when I came to the University of Chicago very, very young. These were the years in which a man called Robert Maynard Hutchins, a very great educator, had a system, quite mad, wonderfully mad, whereby he said, if you think you're smart and think it's a waste of time, American college, which it largely was, you can take as many final exams as you want on arrival. And whatever you get an A in, you don't need to take the course. And I took all the 14 final exams on arrival and failed magnificently, but D minus, F, double minus in 4 of them, being a product of the French, Greek, Latin, classical syllabus. I failed, of course, in math, physics, chemistry, and something I'd never heard of called social studies. I literally didn't know what it meant. It was incredibly thrilling. It was sociology and anthropology with people like Redfield and others. Fermi, the cracker of the atom, was teaching idiots like me physics, Urey, another of the giants of our century in chemistry, and so on. And I just loved it. It was a revelation, this other universe. And when I had done my little year, I was able to do the BA in a year because you could do 4 courses in a year, and done well in the exams, I ran like a little peacock to a creature called graduate advisor. And I said, I'd like to go on in science, Chicago being at that time stuffed with Nobels and one of the world's greatest scientists. And he called for my papers, and he said, please don't take it personally. You got a summa cum laude, but you're an idiot in a technical sense. That is to say, your European training meant you learned every damn formula by heart, and you learned certain techniques. There's not a spark of creative mathematical understanding in you. Now, very interesting, that story. Had I come 2 or 3 years later to this same man, he would have said, look, try biology or go talk to my colleagues where there isn't a need for creative mathematical understanding. At that time, written on the doors of the university graduate schools in science with either nuclear physics or bottle washing. And for nuclear physics, you need that intuitive spark. So I was heartbroken. But again, it meant that my interest in the sciences, so far as any layman can keep up at all, which is very, very limited, very amateurish, prevented certain kinds of specialization. I just know that if we were living in the Florence of the 15th century, you and I would hope to have breakfast from time to time with the painters. And I've been privileged at Princeton, at Cambridge, to have breakfast with the scientists, whose world is at the moment intellectually by far the most exciting, the most challenging, and philosophically one of the most interesting in the history of the West. And this makes it impossible to be what so many in my profession reproach me for not being, the deep specialist, the master of one tiny area. Cows have fields. I'm not a cow. I have deep respect for cows, and they produce all the hot milk, etc. But you can't fake that one. Too many things have fascinated me.
One of your most ambitious interdisciplinary books, if you like, is After Babel, and it explores some questions that I'd like to ask you about. One that I find very tantalizing is the idea that the existence of a future tense, or if proposition, empowers us to hope. Or, as you put it, we endure because we can speak tomorrow.
We know next to nothing about the origins of human speech. There have been ambitious books in the last few years. There have been since the 18th century, trying to guess. We know next to nothing. But there are some indications that it was a very slow, a very gradual process. That would make sense. Our larynx, our vocal cords had to change and become adapted to the rich variety of speech sounds beyond those available to animals. Probably the brain had to reach a critical mass. Something very exciting seems to have happened around the end of the last ice age. And it began involving not consuming on the spot what you had hunted or planted, putting it away, the notion of a future. Hebrew does not have our verb tenses. Hebrew has a single essential verb system where past, present, and future are very curiously the same, and you have to show which you mean by inflections and so on. Hebrew lives within a kind of eternity. Greek develops, among many other languages, this complicated and fantastic idea that you can speak about the Monday morning about your own death perfectly coherently, and that you can now speak about constellations or galaxies or black holes and what they're doing and where they will be 1 billion years after the extinction of our solar system, which is certain to come. That's one quite amazing feat. It never cease to start. The second thing you can do is you can reinvent the world. You can say the sentence, if Napoleon had been in charge of the American army at Vietnam, and so on. If Hitler had been shot in 1933 when there was an attempt. So quite fantastic that you can do that. And then coherently go on and create an alternative language world. My hunch is, and that's the one I argue, that the certainty of biological death, which most of us try to forget about our whole lives, the absolute, ineluctable certainty of extinction might not have been bearable to us had we not developed these complicated and magical ways of thinking beyond ourselves and beyond brutal biological reality. And that language is the way we do that. Animals don't. We can only guess whether animals have any consciousness of their own death, but one thing they certainly don't have is a future tense or subjunctive forms of the verb.
But you put so much in the grammar itself. I mean, you say the utopian and the messianic are figures of syntax. But what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, is language the egg from which emerges the chicken of hope?
There's no answer to that whatever. They might have come together. They might have come from a reciprocal need, from a dialectic of emotion looking for expressive forms. There's absolutely no answer to that. I take music to be much older and more universal than language. And music can give joy, hope in many, many ways, but it does not have this peculiar power of future projection. How this arose, when for the first time a human being did speak about the time after his own death, not in some fantasy of the world of Elysium or the underworld or a myth, but actually saying this town is going to be in much worse shape 100 years from now or whatever, unless we do or if we don't, we certainly can't identify. What has struck me so much is that cultures of deprivation, of hunger, of extremely marginal life, as in the desert, in the Kalahari Desert, or among the Bushmen, have a wealth of future forms and conditionals as if they were compensating linguistically for the grimness and the time-bound misery of their economic and social lives. And this is a very striking contrast.
You also pose a question that I'm amazed no one has really been able to answer, or even before you even ask, which is, why are there so many languages?
That no one wants to tackle that one. We now know that the whole Chomskyan revolution doesn't work. I mean, a number of us knew this from the start, or said it, and were silenced and almost ostracized from serious discussion. No Chomskyans have ever tried to answer the questions in After Babel. The book is taboo. Now, the notion of a single, universal, underlying grammar is unquestionably true in the sense in which it's true to say we all need oxygen. Quite right. Or that all of us will die if we breathe too much carbon dioxide. Quite right. It's also terribly trivial and uninteresting. The really exciting and problematic question is why some 20 to 25,000 tongues have been spoken on this tiny planet. Why, within 114 or 120 languages in the Philippines, there should be 2 that have no connection with any other, 3 kilometers away from their neighbor. Why French word pain is totally untranslatable into English bread, and reciprocally, and so on. And that's why I put forward the guess that even as there are far too many species, 150,000 beetles of great beauty, of great intricacy in one tiny corner of the Amazon, this richness, this overproduction, this prodigality of expressive means has something to do with the human need for freedom, for structuring as many worlds as possible, for reading the world in many, many different ways. And the corollary, on which I have no doubt whatever, is that the death of a language, and they're dying all around us, the death of a language is irretrievable, as is the death of fauna and flora. They're trying to do something with artificial semen in frozen zoos. You can't even do that with language. You can never bring back to life, except in an academic experiment, a language. And in my own lifetime, so many important languages have died. The last native speaker of Manx, an ancient and important English language, language of the British Isles, died about 30, 40 years ago. A deeply intricate, fascinatingly complex and unique language spoken in the Pripetsk marshes between Poland, Lithuania, and what was the Soviet Union. It's called a Liven language. 9 people now speak it. And it is tape-recorded. People speak into tape recorders, and I know that that's right and that scholars want to have that at least. It's also unutterably sad. It's like putting Stradivari in air-conditioned glass cases, and there they die in the great silence of not being used. So that the death of a language is the death of a possibility of experiencing and understanding the world.
Something you talked about when we spoke 3 years ago has continued to trouble me, and I mean, actually a number of things have, but in this case, I was pleased to note in one of your books that you confessed to finding this an obsessive, almost maddening question, and that is, does the cry in the tragic play muffle or even blot out the cry in the street? In other words, does art not only not humanize us, but desensitize us?
Pragmatically, it seems to me that this is the rather awful and paradoxical case. Again and again, I've in my own little life known emotions coming off the page, off a painting, off a piece of music particular, of overwhelming totality, and they have blotted out the messy, sad, uncouth reality of daily needs in others, that there is something inhuman in the cultivation of the imagination, that where the imagination is made so receptive, so responsive to fiction, reality tends to pale. What Freud called the reality principle gets remoter and remoter. But the example I always gave is if you've been all day long reading Lear, or acting Lear, or reciting Lear, or learning Lear by heart, if you've been telling your students about the agony of Cordelia, if somebody yells out there, you're going to get very mad. You can say, shut up. I'm trying to understand one of the summits of human speech and perception and insight, and they yell again, and you don't go to the window, or you certainly don't rush downstairs to be of help. There is a isolation in the emotions of great art, generated by great thought and art, which often cuts human beings off from the unthinking immediacy of response and reflex, which should be that of our humaneness. I don't see my way out of that. I've wanted my whole life long to try and say, isn't there a way of teaching great literature which makes you politically, socially more responsive? And there certainly none has turned up. None has turned up. And the Academy is in many ways now more unreal to the problems on its doorstep, particularly in the inner city where it is often located, than it has ever been before.
But if you really believe that, I mean, and you quote Coleridge, poetry excites us to artificial feelings and makes us callous to real ones. If you really believe it, how could you devote so much of your life to teaching an appreciation of high art, an appreciation of the cry in the tragic play?
Because I failed. It's not at all complicated. To be a Mother Teresa is given to very few. To be a Médecins Sans Frontières is given to very few. The derived, the reflected image in great art and literature is not only an inexhaustible joy, it flatters one, often with a sense of self-importance. The person who's in a geriatric ward all night, cleaning up the spilled over excrements of old, dying and incontinent patients, presumably, if one is religious, if one is even ethically fully serious, presumably stands much higher on the scale of need and human value than does the greatest explicator of Lear or of Coleridge. I've never doubted that. These human beings who don't like to be talked about and don't like to talk about themselves will somewhere, if there is a last judgment, be very far ahead of you and me on the queue, but very, very far ahead. Otherwise, what's it all about? There was a time when great causes enlisted intellectual risk and support, what was called engagement, committal after the war. In Cambridge itself, I still have known people, they're now too old or gone, who dropped their tutorials and examination papers to die or to fight in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. It was a movement that drew tremendous intellectual risk and participation. One of the horrors today is, for what cause would one drop everything and go out and risk it? It is the premature irony and cynicism of our young. I can almost state that. I was supervising at the time of the Contra, the Nicaraguan horror. San Salvador, San Salvador, Civil War, one of the most cruel butcheries, and dropped some remark, some silly, unguarded remark to my Cambridge students, I imagine none of you will be doing what your grandfathers or fathers did, leaving me a note, sorry, no essay next week, am off to San Salvador. And they got together and wrote me a letter and said, look, if we go to fight for the left, we know it will end up as a Stalinist horror of communist concentration camps if they win. If we go for the right, it's a farce of American-supported CIA fascism. Why? We won't. We're not going to be caught again. We're not going to be taken in. It's one of the saddest documents. I've kept it, of course. Utterly right, utterly insightful. It's awful if at 19 or 20 you know that much. It's awful if you can no longer commit the great mistakes of hope and of passionate idealism. And our crime against the young is the extent to which we have bequeathed to them an insight of detached, ironic, savvy. Their fathers and grandfathers were still ready to make very big mistakes. And he who has not made some big mistakes when he's young is probably going to be a very boring person when he grows up.
Obviously, George Steiner, you enjoy the contradictions of human nature. And for instance, with respect to the great Marxist critic Lukács, you ask, what enables a man to illuminate Goethe and Balzac in the morning and be an outrider to Stalinism in the afternoon? Or with respect to the famous spy and art historian Anthony Blunt, you ask, what enables a man in the morning to teach students that a false attribution of a Watteau drawing or an inaccurate transcription of a 14th century epigraph is a sin against the spirit, and in the afternoon to transmit to the agents of Soviet intelligence classified information? How do you answer these questions?
I was one of the first, if my work is to have any little echo after me, it will be that. I was one of the first to ask this question in an even sharper form. You play Schubert and then go and torture people, and we can document this. And the easy way out of saying you play him badly, the hell you do. You play him very beautifully and with deep insight and love. And this question, which rings through everything I've written, which is the center of, as I come after the Shoah, after the Holocaust and so on, and the massacres of today, and Stalinism, seems to me finally the most important of all. There have been a lot of answers. Arthur Koestler, whom I had the privilege of knowing, Arthur Koestler said, it's perfectly obvious, and he's written about this, we are in a stage of evolution where our animal and sadistic back brain, the big part, which he identified with the back of the head, the thalamus, is still too strong to be overcome by the small, evolving front lobes of the brain, which are the seat of moral feeling, of reasoning, of self-control. And at the slightest possibility of provocation, the back of us takes over, and the bestiality has its fun, which doesn't mean that the front doesn't have its also, and we are basically a schizophrenic creature, part bestial, part profoundly artistic, cultivated, loving, responsive, and so on. I gather this isn't so, or at least I have no qualification. It has never found favor with neurophysiologists and with people who work on these brain and behavior patterns. Others have said, look, it is something peculiar in German high civilization, whose love of poetry and music was a sentimental veneer over a profound political brutality and bestiality. It's endemic in German history. It's there right from the start. It's in Luther's terrible pamphlets about burning Jews. It's there in Nietzsche and Wagner, the famous classical argument. They've just never grown up into the perception of a balanced humanity. I don't buy that one because I've remained surprised to this day that it happened in Germany and not in France or Austria or a whole number of other places. But there are cultural historians convinced that it was just incredible bad luck. There have been many answers. I have none. I keep asking the question. It presses upon me continually. The only thing that is clear are the facts. Great art does not protect us against barbarism. Very often, as you know, it plays with it, it collaborates with it. And wherever you look at great lives, you will find areas of almost unspeakable darkness. Not all, but in the vast majority. And I know no way out of that labyrinth. Proust, in his private bordello, or the one he partially owned, Proust tortured animals, etc., and had young women perform certain acts which he wished to describe exactly in the novel. You and I are forever and overwhelmingly in his debt. I couldn't imagine my life without the remembrance of things past, without Proust's work. Next question, was that price too high? And that really is a religious question.
George Steiner, I want to ask you about something that you recently said troubles you, and this was in response to a book of essays in your honor, a sort of festschrift, and that has to do with a shift in your aesthetic response that you describe as Christianizing. And this surprised me, and as you say in your remark, it surprised you.
I don't accept it. I know what it's based on. It is based on the fact that, as I'm arguing, and arguing very vehemently, that the ultimate underwriting, the ultimate reassurance for a belief in language, for a belief in meaning, for a belief in form and communication, cannot be formal. It cannot just be technical. Deconstruction has shown that. And I began asking myself, what is the reinsurance behind my belief in the survival of art, of language, of intelligence, of communication? And it turned out to be a theological, a bet, a kind of wager on the possibility that human creativity has some kind of distant analogy with what we metaphorize as divine creativity. An old idea, nothing original, nothing new. And when you deal with that material, you're going to have to deal with certain great Christian insights, of course, into it, all the way from Thomas Aquinas up and down and onward to our own time. And you're going to have to deal with the peculiar Christian mystery or doctrine of something being made form, incarnation, being made flesh, that something earthly has shining through it the light of a possible other presence, real presence as I call it. So in that sense, yes, I'm drawing also on Christian material, and any serious person dealing with art in Western tradition has to, as he would have to deal with Buddhism if writing about art in China and Japan and the interior of Asia.
George Steiner, you seem increasingly drawn to music, and it's much too big a subject to plumb now, but there's something you say that I do have to ask you about. You write that addicts of language and of reading often turn to music in their decline. Now I'm putting in their decline in italics because surely you don't see yourself as in.
Of course I do. I'm in my 67th year as of a week from now. I'll be 66, and this is entirely familiar phenomenon. Many people of my age turn to music more and more. Interesting why this should be. I'm not sure psychologists are very much agreed on it. I also find myself rereading constantly and perhaps reading new things less than I ought to. Courtesy bids one say that's my own fault. I'm not so sure. The state of the novel at the moment, and I do say this with deep respect, in the city of Monroe, of Robertson Davis, of Margaret Atwood, and many others, and I'm very conscious of being in this city. Nevertheless, I pick up new novels because professionally, and after 5 pages, I drop them with a feeling of being talked to as an infant, that the infantilism, the cliché-written monotony. In England, it's whether you should commit adultery in Hampstead or in Westminster, and so on and so forth. I was at Gallimard, my own great publisher, recently. They say there isn't a novel worth reading. That is the house which in Europe had all the great novelists. There's wonderful poetry being written, which I do try to keep up with, but We are in a major period of music. There are 10 or 12 world-class composers at the moment, difficult music, avant-garde music, music which often first puts you off and you keep having to work at it, but I've absolutely no doubt that this is one of the great periods of musical creation. And I try to keep up. I do my very, very best. I go to the concerts, I collect the recordings, I try to hear what is new in music, and I find it immensely exciting and challenging. I don't find literature at the moment. What are the bestsellers of the good bookstores, of good publishers' biographies, and political documents in documentation? Not all periods have major literary genius. Happens, goes up and down. It's a very curious, complicated, cyclical process. So that I find immense refreshment in trying to stay a little young by keeping up with what is going on in music. And music, if you have deep personal relations, which I'm lucky enough to have, music is the only thing in the world which you hear alone with someone else. We don't have a good word for that. Both are alone and both are together, both human beings. Reading used to be possible, to read out loud to each other. We don't do it anymore. It's an enormous loss. And music, you can be next to the human being you need most in the world, or care for most, or the group of human beings you want to be closest to. And each one of them is sharing a unique aloneness. And again, that in later age in one's life proves to be a very important experience.
With all respect, you don't speak like a man in decline. A word that I keep coming across in your work is remembrancer. And
it's a legal word. I've stolen it from 17th and 18th century law books, and you'll find it in the Oxford Dictionary as a legal term. I use it to mean someone who tries to make other people responsible to their own memories. As you may know, I regard the end of learning by heart in schools, the end of a classical discipline of language, of history, as planned amnesia. Our young are being brought up with no past. Ask, even from the very best schools, the Korean War doesn't exist, the Vietnam War is now gone, the Gulf War will be within next year. There is simply no remembering whatever. A remembrancer is a human being who knows that to be a human being is to carry within yourself a responsibility not only to your own present, but to the past behind you from which you come. He's a kind of witness through memory. And in the specific sense, I've always had deep conviction, having been perhaps too often to the sites of the unspeakable in Eastern Europe, with their millions of names on walls, or their non-names, the unnameable, who were made ash. I've proposed many, many years ago, and this is not at all an apocalyptic or tragic proposal. It's almost strangely a joyous proposal that each of us learn by heart the name of 10 people on one of those walls of hundreds of thousands, or on the Vietnam War Memorial, that immensely moving one in Washington, designed by a young woman. Pick 10, learn them by heart, and once a month recite them to yourself or to anyone you love or is near you, so that someone on this earth remembers. And that tiny proposal encapsulates almost everything I try to do in my work.
It's a privilege and always very stimulating. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
George Steiner with me in Toronto in 1995. He died last week. He was 90 years old. His most recent titles are My Unwritten Books and an essay, The Poetry of Thought.